Thank you for the opportunity. We have a challenging topic to discuss. Just by way of setting the context, Ravi, my colleague from India, and I, we were in the St. George Cathedral, Anglican Cathedral in Jerusalem this morning in the Nablus Street. And it's a very interesting experience because in that church they have the coat of arms of the United Kingdom prominently placed. The British left it behind when they departed on the 14th of May 1948, and it's now centrepiece in the cathedral. And they even have a map at the back of their liturgy, which is a very interesting map. You might be interested in that, Alan, which suggests that we already have a two-state solution. The land is divided between Israel and Palestine. So the message there is very much that Palestine exists, it belongs to the Arab people, and this is the kind of mentality that I think is very much dominant in Europe, in the Western world. And it occurred to me actually as a non-Jew and non-Israeli how challenging it is, how difficult it is when we have moved in 2,000 years so far from Israel and from the Jewish people. It's our whole mentality, our culture, our political systems have great difficulty accepting and understanding Jewish sovereignty in this land. And it goes very deep into our psychology. And the work that we're trying to do outside Israel is really trying to build a bridge, as it were, I think, between your wonderful work here to try and advocate, to speak into governments, to speak into the public space about the importance of the restoration of the Jewish national home in Palestine and what Israel represents and how it's not the problem or the obstacle to world peace in the Middle East, but it's actually a very important part of the solution. That's our work that we try and do at the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. Now, we did a study which we've just released, and this is one of our first opportunities to share it with you, and I hope all of you will take a copy with you before you go. It's free of charge. If you want to make a donation to our work, it's very welcome. But I'm not actually formally selling them. Thank you to JCPA for allowing me to do that. But we want to get this message out. And it's not really a message here for Jerusalem and Israel. It's a message for our governments in Europe. We wrote this report for politicians, political leaders, policy advisors, others of influence in Europe, because we think this whole process that Europe has been driving now for 5 decades is deeply a part of the problem. Europe is playing a role which I think is playing very much into what we've witnessed here over the last few days, and the rockets from Gaza and so forth. Comes very much from this idea that Israel is oppressing the Palestinian people, it's depriving them of their legitimate rights simply by existing, simply by trying to defend itself. So, that by way of introduction. So for over 5 decades since the Yom Kippur in 1973, the EU has, with increasing vigor and assertiveness and even aggression, advocated the idea that the establishment of a fully sovereign Palestinian state in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip is the only possible solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's also a condition to peace and security in the Middle East and the world generally. So unless this state is created, in Europe's view, we are going to have a risk and a threat to world peace and security. The EU's two-state policy is very simple. Through a cascading range of legal parameters, policies and programs, the EU demands the partition of the land west of the Jordan into 2 separate states, through the establishment by means of negotiation of an independent, democratic, contiguous, sovereign and viable Palestinian state, which must have East Jerusalem as its capital and be based on what Europe refers to as the 1967 borders, unless the Palestinians agree otherwise, which we don't see happening very often. So despite decades of strenuous EU efforts, billions and billions of euros, over €1 billion a year, from Brussels to the Palestinian Authority and the many Palestinian NGOs. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's much more money coming from Europe in this direction. The reality is that we are still light years away from either a negotiated settlement or a democratic and viable Palestinian state. Democratic institutions of government are lacking. Palestinian institutions and society are corrupt and radicalized. All Palestinian organizations, from the PLO and the PA down, continue to promote the destruction of Israel and reward attacks on and the killing of Jews. The Oslo negotiation process has expired effectively. And as the current conflict with Gaza demonstrates, the security risks mean that unilateral Israeli withdrawal from East Jerusalem or any part of the West Bank is currently completely unrealistic. So in short, coupled with the situation created by the Oslo Accords, the EU approach to this conflict is nothing short of a disaster. This report raises the obvious questions that somehow no one in Europe dares to ask. Is the establishment of a Palestinian state the only way to satisfy Palestinian legitimate demands for self-determination and achieve peace in the region? Is a Palestinian state, as envisaged by the EU, required by international law, as the EU claims it is? Is it compatible with Israeli sovereignty? Is it achievable? Do the Palestinians even want it? And assuming it's feasible, why has it so far failed and what should be done? This report was written for European policymakers. It analyzes the problems and suggests a new way forward. We urge the EU to abandon the idea that there is only one predetermined outcome to negotiations. And we advocate a much more realistic and cautious approach based not on fantastic ideas of a utopia somehow, but on a realistic acknowledgement of the legal, historical, and political facts on the ground. The authors of the report are Professor Wolfgang Bock from the University of Gießen in Germany, Professor Gregory Rose from the University of Wollongong in Australia, and myself. We argue that the EU two-state policy is based on wishful thinking and the deliberate manipulation of international law in order to advance European economic interests, primarily access to oil. There are three fundamental false assumptions in our view, each of which is dealt with in the report, and we believe each of these themes needs to be thoroughly revisited in order to achieve a change of policy. One is about history, understanding the nature of the conflict and Europe's role in this conflict. The second theme is a legal theme, the way the EU deals with public international law. And the third aspect is about policy, the cultural, political, and religious impediments to the establishment of a Palestinian state. Those are the three themes we deal with in the report. So I just want to take you very briefly through the main things that we deal with in the report, and then I'll come to our main conclusions and recommendations. By the way, a lot of this is very familiar to all of you, so I apologize if I'm perhaps treading on familiar ground, but for many in Europe, it's not. They have little understanding of the history of the modern state of Israel. They have very little understanding even of the nature of their own government's involvement in this conflict. Most people in Europe, I live in the Netherlands, although I come from Australia, the media says nothing about all of this. So there's a lack of information, a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge. So first of all, history. We have a chapter about the conflict because nobody knows that this conflict actually started before 1967. If you read, good morning, Maurice, nice to see you. Come on in, yeah. And if you read the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in 2004, you wouldn't know that there was a conflict before 1947. It mentions the mandate for Palestine, I think, in one passing sentence. This whole conflict started apparently when Israel occupied Arab territory. So we have a chapter which talks about what happened in the First World War, the collapse of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, the Balfour Declaration, San Remo, the Mandate for Palestine, and the series of negotiations under the Mandate period in which the Palestinian Arab leadership, of course it wasn't called the Palestinian Arab leadership at the time, they regarded themselves as part of the great Arab nation from Syria, but they rejected time and again a one-state solution, a two-state solution. And the British were coming up with these proposals, you know, the Peel Commission, the MacDonald White Paper in 1939, leading up to the UN Partition Plan in 1947, all rejected by the Arab leadership. At the time, nobody knows this anymore. So by the time you get to the Palestine National Charter in 1964, we discover that the Palestinians are just repeating the arguments that they were already being made in 1920. And the core of it is very simple. That is, the Balfour Declaration, the idea of a Jewish nation in Palestine is completely illegitimate because it fundamentally undermines the rights of the indigenous people, namely the non-Jewish Palestinian population. That's the core of their claim. And they'll talk about two states, they'll talk about the partition plan and all of this, but at the core of it is this idea the Mandate for Palestine was deeply illegitimate and has no basis in international law or morality. So the arguments that they're making in the International Criminal Court today, or the Court of Justice, there are two cases going on, by the way, at the Court of Justice in The Hague, which involve this issue. One is the Palestinians against the United States of America for moving their embassy. Good to have you here, David, thinking of the embassy. The Palestinians say it's illegitimate for the US to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Why? Because Jerusalem does not belong to the state of Israel, not even West Jerusalem. That's their claim. International Criminal Court, the same thing, and the prosecutor buys into this kind of line of reasoning. It's become mainstream. So we need to get to the bottom of the very character and nature of the conflict, and we argue it's not a territorial conflict, it's an existential conflict. And until the other side recognizes and accepts the legitimacy of the Jewish nation, not even the state of Israel, but the Jewish self-determination, we won't see a resolution, even through a two-state solution, to the conflict. So that's chapter 2. Chapters 3 and 4 go on to look at the genesis and development of the European policy in all of this. Where did it come from? How did Europe get to the point? I find it myself remarkable. You know, it's 100 years ago when the international community, universally, everybody accepted the right of the Jewish people to a national home in Palestine. It was reflected in the Mandate, which was adopted as a treaty by the League of Nations. How does we get to the point where Europe says, no, most of Palestine belongs to the Arabs? Let's put Transjordan and Jordan to one side for the moment. The heartland of the Jewish homeland belongs to the Arab people, is the core of the European approach. Well, it all came out of this process, I think, after the Second World War. Europe never really accepted the legitimate acceptance of the state of Israel, in my view. So when we got to 1967, there's the whole discussion about the territories. Europe was confronted with a problem and a challenge. Europe was irrelevant on the world stage. It was struggling to be reunited. Of course, 67 is only a decade after the Rome Treaty, when the European Economic Community was established. So France and Germany in particular were trying to unite and reunite and create this kind of European identity. After the Yom Kippur in 1967, that was the moment when Europe had to make a decision. Sorry, 1973, the Yom Kippur War, October 73, I think was the watershed. The 6 founding members of the European Economic Community were joined by Great Britain, Ireland, and Denmark. That became the 9. And the 9 had to develop, for the first time in history, a European common foreign policy. So the first step in European common foreign policy was Palestine, Israel. November 1973, when they came together in Copenhagen and issued a statement declaring, under pressure from the Arab world and the Arab oil boycott, obviously, that they were going to support the Palestinian cause. And I think that's the genesis of the modern European policy. And we had a whole series of meetings in different capital cities of Europe between 1967 and 1980. And a lot of our report is really a study of those years. And we look particularly at what happened in Britain, in Germany, France, and the Netherlands, which I think were instrumental in all of this, where basically the rest of the European entities came around to the French way of thinking. And of course, the French were not particularly positive about the existence of the Jewish state. They were very concerned to win friends in the Arab world, to regain their stature as the French power in the Middle East, which they felt they'd lost after the First World War. So you get to 1980 and the issuing of the Venice Declaration, which formally speaking is the basis of the modern two-state policy, but I think, as I say, it comes out of those preceding 13 years. And the Venice Declaration says, in very clear terms, it doesn't talk about statehood, but it talks about recognition of the Palestinian problem. So the problem is no longer about enabling the Jewish people to have a national home. It's all about enabling the Palestinians to have a national home. That becomes the burden for Europe. It becomes, pardon me, the whole thrust of the European policy, thank you so much, is to make sure the Palestinians get what they really deserve. Pardon me, in 1980, for the first time, it is said that settlements are not only an obstacle to peace, but they are illegitimate and illegal under international law. And of course, then we have the whole process after 1980. Around 2000, 1999, 2000, there's a new kind of an idea which comes into European foreign policy making. It's the idea of justice. It's this whole idea that we Europeans know how to create world peace because we've done that after the Second World War. We have created a European Union which lives in peace and security with each other, and that's the model for the rest of the world. So if only you can learn in the Middle East how to live with each other as we Europeans are, then we will achieve justice and peace in the Middle East. And this concept of a just solution to the conflict, and we see this creeping into European policy documents around this time, and they even bring this into the policy regarding the conflict here, that it's actually Israel's obligation to give justice to the Palestinians. This is a deeply European value that we feel you should be adopting. So we require you as Europe, we require you as Israel to adopt this policy of giving justice to the Palestinians. And I think this is why, the heart of this feeling that Israel is denying the Palestinians something they have a legitimate fundamental right to. Anyway, there's a lot more to be said about that, but we go into all of that in chapters 3 and 4 of the book. There's a turning point in 2012 in the UN. Of course, we have the whole dynamic of the United Nations, decolonization in the 60s, the growth of UN member states, right up to the current 193 member states, most of them hostile to Western values, and Europe trying to position itself within the UN, particularly after the fall of communism. It's trying to maneuver itself, position itself between the United States and the Soviets, before the fall of the wall and afterwards to play this role of bringing European values to the rest of the world. And when in 2012 the Palestinians again applied for recognition as statehood, they'd obviously done it many times before, but Resolution 6719 was adopted, granting the Palestinians non-member observer state status. It's the first time Palestinians officially get a kind of statehood recognition in the UN. And we saw that Europe was divided in the vote on that resolution. I think only one UN member state voted in favour of the resolution. A number of them, I think 14, abstained, and the others voted against. So actually, despite the fact that there is a unified position from Brussels, within the member states of the European Union, there's much division of position. So you have countries like Hungary, Czech Republic, some of the Baltic states, Poland, who are not comfortable with this idea that our sole job as Europe is to create a Palestinian state. They know that something is not quite right. I'll come back to it in a moment, because there are many opportunities in Europe for a new approach, I think. In Chapter 5, we look more at the politics of international law in our chapters which talk about the international law aspects. And obviously international law is very political by its nature. It's the law of nations, and nations enter into political relations with each other. So by definition, international law has a very political dimension. But we take a very positivist view towards law, and we argue that if you're going to talk about law, then you should talk about law and not politics, right? So a lot of what the European Court of Justice is doing, and a lot of the rhetoric of law coming out of Brussels, coming out of the capitals of Europe, is not law at all. It's justice dressed up in legal language. And they use the arguments of international law to support their position. And in fact, they're very open about it. There are those, I won't mention names, but there are very leading legal minds in Europe, Jewish and non-Jewish, which are advocating this approach that Israel is nothing more than an occupying power in the territories. It has no claims whatsoever to East Jerusalem or Judea and Samaria. The idea that Israel, even the occupation, must come to an end at a certain point, that the Palestinians have a kind of sovereignty over the territory. There are eminent legal minds in Europe advocating this position. But I think it's a very political position. They're not really using the arguments of law as such. So we put the arguments here about if, law consists of customary law and treaty law. And yes, the views of eminent jurists are important, but they don't make law. Neither do UN resolutions make international law. You have to dig deeper. You have to look at what the legal principles really are. And when you get down to it, you realize that Israel actually has very good claims, certainly to East Jerusalem and also to Judea and Samaria. And Israel is much more than an occupying power. And no, the Palestinians do not have sovereignty over these territories. They do not have a right to statehood. Nobody has a right to statehood. So that's about law and politics. We have a chapter on UN Security Council Resolution 242. Everybody talks about 242 as kind of the basis for this whole thing. Well, 242 was a political, non-binding resolution. It was a compromise text. It's not a binding source of international law. Israel is not under a binding obligation under international law to withdraw from the territories. There is no principle of international law which obliges Israel to withdraw from the territories, even as an occupying power. There's an obligation to reach a peace treaty, or to at least be open and to negotiate in good faith towards a peace treaty. There's an obligation to respect Palestinian rights, even political rights to self-determination. But it's not an obligation to withdraw from the territories. And Israel is perfectly entitled to insist on its sovereign claims and rights with respect to the territories. And 242 does not actually deny that. So 242 is often used by the Palestinians as an argument to say that Israel has illegitimately acquired control of the territories through its acquisition of territory by force, which is illegal under international law. This phrase is used all the time, right, in the preambles to resolutions, recognizing the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force, blah, 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 as if Israel has illegitimately acquired this territory in 1967 by force. Everybody accepts that Israel was acting defensively. Even the Security Council at the time acknowledged that Israel had a legitimate right to keep control of these territories in having won a defensive war. And by the way, it's given back most of the territories in the meantime. So that's 242. And then we look at the three key legal themes which are really relevant to this whole legal discussion. The first of them is about territorial sovereignty. The second is about self-determination. And the third is about the law of belligerent occupation. In my view, these are the key kind of legal issues underlying the conflict, if you want to analyze it legally. So we talk about, well, what is territorial sovereignty? How do you acquire territorial sovereignty? And to which territory did Israel acquire sovereignty when it became a state? And there's no way of getting around it that you can only understand Israel's legal position from May 1948 onwards by looking back at the mandate for Palestine. It forms the legal foundation for perhaps not the existence of the State of Israel, but certainly for the determination of its territory. It was birthed, legally speaking, out of the mandate. Israel was the state that emerged from a mandate. Like many other mandates in the world, Syria emerged out of the mandate for Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and there are many other mandate territories. So a similar process happened with the creation of the State of Israel. The Palestinians could have had their state in 1948. It was open to them to declare the existence of an Arab Palestinian state, but they rejected the partition plan. They didn't want their own state if Israel was going to have a state. So Israel came into existence. Its borders were not determined. The Declaration of Independence talks about Eretz Israel, doesn't talk about borders. As I understand it, Ben-Gurion was against making a definition of borders. I think Shabtai Rosen was in favor, but Ben-Gurion said, no, we're not going to determine our borders. If they attack us and we take more territory, then we want to have the right to be in the territory that we have control over, which is, of course, what happened. So the only way of looking at sovereignty, I think, is from the perspective of the mandate. And being the only state that came into existence in 1948, in principle, it's the principle of uti possidetis juris. It's rather controversial, but in any other context around the world, it's not at all controversial. The idea that Israel, the sovereignty of Israel, became the borders of the mandate for Palestine, even though Israel did not have control because of the Jordanian illegal attack and occupation. And Egypt, Israel didn't have control of Judea and Samaria, didn't have control of East Jerusalem or Gaza or the Golan. Nevertheless, legally speaking, it had a right to sovereignty over those territories. Of course, Europe accepts this principle anywhere else. Look at the Balkans, look at the creation of the states that came out of the former Yugoslavia. Were all determined on the basis of this principle of uti possidetis juris. The borders of a state emerge out of the pre-existing administrative borders of the entity that pre-existed the states. So most borders in the world are created on this basis. I come from Australia. Well, it's pretty easy to determine the borders of Australia because it's an island, so there was no argument about it. But most colonies that became states, the states just assumed the borders of the colony. That's most of Africa. It's most of parts of Europe as well. So this principle should have equal application, in my view, to the situation in Israel. Now, of course, the issue arises after 1967. Israel did not claim sovereignty or assert sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. What does that mean? We'll come back to that. It makes it complex. As to self-determination, do the Palestinians have a right to self-determination? What does it mean? Well, there are three categories of the right to self-determination in international law. One is the case of decolonization. So we have the famous case of the Chagos Islands. We had an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice just a couple of years ago, which said that the Chagos Islands have a right to exist, independent existence from the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom failed in its responsibility to enable the islands to be truly independent. But that's because it was all about the decolonization under a colonial rule. Now, the idea that Israel is a colonial power overriding the Palestinians, this is the framing that many want to assert. Israel is no more than a colonial enterprise, and Palestine is the last remaining vestige of decolonization. I think that's what drives many people, why they're so passionate about it. This is their final opportunity to achieve justice in the world by giving the Palestinians freedom from an illegitimate colonizing power. Well, of course, that's a false narrative, because Israel itself was a product of decolonization coming out of the Mandate, the legitimate expression of a Jewish right to self-determination. And again, the Palestinians had their chances, many of them, which they've consistently denied. So the discussion, I think the framing of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians is important, that we push back against this idea that that the Palestinians have an automatic right to statehood because they're fighting against a colonial power. Many lawyers believe this deeply. They think Palestine is a non-governing territory. Under UN law, non-governing, what's the correct term, Alan? Non-governing territories under the UN Charter have a right to self-determination and even statehood. But Palestinians are not amongst those. You have other cases of self-determination rights, external self-determination rights, where a people group claims a right to existence. And arguably, I think the Palestinians have that right to some kind of autonomy, some kind of independent existence. And then the third category of self-determination is what's called internal self-determination. That's the rights of minorities within states, to be recognized as a minority, to be recognized in some way by the constitution or the governing laws of a state. That would be the rights of the Arab people or the non-Jewish people in Israel, have a kind of internal right of self-determination within Israel. But the core point is that the Palestinians do not have a right to statehood as such. You can only achieve statehood if you earn it, and if you actually assert and exhibit the characteristics of a state. And there's one thing that's sure: the Palestinians under the Palestinian Authority is not a state in legal terms. It does not have a legitimate government that is really governing a people, exercising real power and a responsibility to govern. I think is the core of the reason why it's not a state. Even though according to the International Criminal Court, at the moment they would regard Palestine as a kind of a state. The International Criminal Court 2 years ago came out with a ruling. The whole question before the Criminal Court is Palestine a state, or is it enough of a state to be a member of the Rome Treaty and to be able, therefore, to accuse Israel of war crimes on the territory of Palestine? That's what they claim in The Hague. Israeli leaders are committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, namely the settlements, against the Palestinians on the territory of the state of Palestine. So they have to argue that Palestine is a state, when actually everybody realizes it's not really a state. So international jurists are now kind of creating this new kind of thing, which is a kind of a state. We know there are certain entities in the world we don't really qualify as states, but we'll treat them as states because they have a kind of right to statehood. I think that's the argument for the Palestinians. I think it's an illegitimate argument, doesn't really hold water, but it's carrying weight, unfortunately, in the international institutions. Okay, so that's a lot about law. There's a lot about belligerent occupation. I think the bottom line is, of course, there's a law of belligerent occupation that applies to Israel in the territories. Israel accepts that. The customary law of belligerent occupation applies to it. But Israel does not accept that the Fourth Geneva Convention applies for reasons that are well known. I don't need to go into them. But all that aside, belligerent occupation, there's nothing illegal about it. That's point one. The second point is, there's nothing in the law of belligerent occupation which requires the occupying power to bring the occupation to an end. There's no time limit on an occupation. And the third point is that occupation does not determine the sovereignty of the territory. It's a completely different question. So even if you accept that Israel became an occupying power in 1967, it says nothing about the territorial status of the territories. You can't argue that because Israel's an occupying power, therefore it has no territorial rights. That's a non sequitur. But that's what they do. And that's what many leading lawyers do. They say Israel is a mere occupying power. It is no more than an occupying power. And the European position is very, very strong on this. Because Israel is an occupying power, therefore it has no sovereignty and no claim to sovereignty. East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So we're fighting the Dutch government at the moment about the labelling of products that are coming from the beautiful hills of Judea. What do you put on the label? Where is the product from? You have to, in Europe, you have to label a product to tell the consumers they have a right to know where the product is from. So we say it's a beautiful product from the hills of Judea and Samaria. That seems a pretty fair statement. According to Brussels, no, you're not allowed to say that. You have to say it's from the West Bank, and you have to say it's from an illegal Israeli settlement. And we say, well, who says, first of all, this is from a settlement? Secondly, who says, why should you tell us to call it the West Bank? Why are we not allowed to call it Judea and Samaria? Why would consumers be confused about that? And thirdly, how can you prove that this product is the result of some kind of illegal activity? But this is the chain of thinking. And to get that into the minds of judges and authorities in Europe is a hard job. So that's why we're not fighting, we're advising the company that imports the products to fight this case in the courts, because it's difficult, because there was a very difficult judgment 2019 in the Psagot case, a French wine case, which the European Court of Justice, it's the highest authority in Europe, just repeats this mantra that Israel has no sovereignty in the occupied territories and that settlements are illegal. And they don't analyse it, they don't explain it, but they say because the European Council says it, therefore it is truth. So we have a lot of work to do to talk about what is law. And then we get into politics, and I don't have time to explain it, but our third part of our book is really about this whole thing of Palestinian statehood. Why is it not working? We look at the concept of statehood, really the problem in Palestinian political culture of they're not interested in building a state. It's not their culture to build states. We see it in many other countries in the Middle East. It's not a culture of creating Western states. So the idea of imposing a kind of a Western idea of a state based on the rule of law in the Palestinian territories is a complete utopia, because that's not the way the culture works. If they're to have independence and autonomy, they've got to build that up. Yes, respecting the rule of law and the right and the dignity of individuals, but it's got to be more of a bottom-up approach than a imposed solution. And we look at issues around the EU financing of the Palestinians. As I said, a lot of money going to the Palestinian Authority to build the security apparatus, the police, which is failing. Money into school books, money into UNRWA, the refugee system, the seizing of land in Area C, highly problematic. Because Europe considers that Area C belongs to the Palestinians, it's building houses there in close cooperation with the PA because it's trying to achieve Palestinian statehood on the ground. And they think everything Israel is doing is prohibiting the just creation of Palestinian independence in Area C. And as Alan rightly said, Area C under the Oslo Accords is a subject of negotiation. There's no predetermined outcome about Area C. But Europe has decided it already belongs to the Palestinians, and it's going to make sure that Israel recognizes that right. That's why they put a lot of money into building these schools and houses and so forth in Area C. And it's all very deliberate, it's very strategic, it's well planned because they work very closely with the PA in Ramallah. Highly problematic. So where do we go from here? Okay, I'm going to just bring this to a conclusion. Our conclusions. The EU two-state policy has failed to achieve its objective. It's because each of the three main assumptions underlying the policy has proved to be invalid. A new approach is required. First, the assumption that the conflict must be resolved by a territorial compromise is a false assumption. The goal of the Palestinian organizations, not just Hamas, not just Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also the Palestinian Authority itself. The PLO still exists. That's Israel's negotiating partner. The PLO to this day has never changed its charter since 1968. The promise of Arafat to change those provisions which deny the legitimate existence of the Jewish state have never been implemented. That's been proven. So their objective is not to establish an independent state side by side with Israel, but it is to destroy the Jewish state. And unless the actual goals of these organizations change or are defeated, they will not accept any solution allowing the legitimate existence of the Jewish state of Israel. And neither will Israel accept any solution that compromises its secure existence. And Europe shouldn't be imposing a solution on Israel. Second, the assumption that the West Bank belongs to the Palestinians is also a false assumption. The Palestinian people have a right to self-determination, which Israel has a right to respect, but international law does not require the creation for them of a sovereign Palestinian state. Israel can legitimately insist on a less than state form of Palestinian autonomy due to the circumstances on the ground. Israel is obliged to negotiate in good faith, but it's also entitled under international law of armed conflict to maintain its military administration in the West Bank until such time as a peace agreement is reached that ends the conflict. Israel is entitled to claim sovereignty within the West Bank subject to the Oslo Accords, which are still legally in force. East Jerusalem, in our view, is legally part of the sovereign territory of the State of Israel. Integration of East Jerusalem Arabs should be a matter of high priority, of course, but Israel has agreed in Oslo to negotiate the status of Jerusalem. But it doesn't mean it's abandoned sovereignty over Jerusalem. Finally, the statement that all Israeli settlements are illegal is misleading. The law of belligerent occupation is highly complex, and there are significant uncertainties regarding the application of the law to the complex situation in the West Bank, particularly because Jordan never had sovereignty over those territories. And the whole idea of settlements being a kind of imposition, Israel has never moved its citizens involuntarily into the territories. There's no transfer or deportation, which is what Article 49.6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention is about. So to enable the rule of law, the EU should interpret and apply international laws of sovereignty, statehood, and self-determination and occupation fairly, objectively, and consistently in relation to all actors in the region. It shouldn't single out this conflict for special treatment. Thirdly, the assumption that a peaceful and secure Palestinian state is feasible in the current circumstances is false because it ignores the power structures and the political landscape in the region, one being the influence of Iran within the Palestinian institutions. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad is not acting independently out of the Gaza Strip. Iran is financing and weaponizing the PIJ as many examples. So the relationship between even the PA and the PLO to these external actors also needs to be understood. So the EU should make its support of Palestinian self-determination conditional on benchmarked evidence of progress towards equal citizenship and the legal status in a Palestinian entity. And the drive for energy security that formed the adoption of the European policy in the first place in the 1970s is no longer relevant. Europe is no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil like it used to be. In fact, Israel is now a potential supplier of energy to Europe. The whole context is completely different. So our recommendations: the EU should revise its two-state policy to address these three false assumptions. And we have a whole range of specific, concrete policy proposals, which I don't have time to explain here. Alan, I think I've gone well over time, so I'm going to end there. I hope that's been helpful. I'd like to invite your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. You referred repeatedly in your presentation to the mandatory borders of Palestine. And here is a problem, because in the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1911, before the Balfour Declaration, they describe Palestine as the territory extending on both sides of the Jordan River. And then there was the mandate, as we know, and so on, and then the British cut the eastern part and so on, and they left Palestine only for the West Bank, yeah, where both Arabs and Jews were Palestinians. And that, of course, creates a problem, because unless we bear in mind that distinction, then you don't have a full solution to the two-state nation. Because if you take the whole thing, the two parts of Palestine, so there is already a two-nation solution.
I agree.
It is just to be called, instead of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, it has to be called the Hashemite Kingdom of Palestine, because this is what it is originally. So would you please address
Sure.
that dilemma? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you're absolutely right, obviously. It's a good point. We do address it in the book, and I think it's absolutely essential to talk about Jordan and what is Jordan and how was it created. And indeed, it was carved out of the mandate. There's a bit of a debate about whether the mandate included Transjordan or not, or whether Transjordan under Article 25 of the mandate was legitimately treated as a separate area by the British under the mandate. But either way, quite clearly, Jordan was created as an Arab, and my understanding is the Jews were not allowed to live in Transjordan. It was not only for the Arabs, it was ethnically exclusively for the Arabs. So yes, and I think actually Jordan's role in all of this is going to be critical, and maybe that's something we should be addressing more, is not only the past but also the future, if there's going to be any resolution somehow. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, you might have a different view, but somehow Jordan's going to have to be involved in sorting out this situation, even if Palestinians have a kind of autonomous already today they're highly dependent on Jordan, and Jordan has control over the Temple Mount and the holy sites, Islamic sites. So, but I think you're right. Historically, I think you're correct.
Yes.
So, did I understand you correctly when you said that the Security Council Resolution 242 is non-binding?
That's correct.
Yes.
There's only one kind of UN resolution
is it
that's binding, and that is a Chapter 7 Security Council resolution. And all the Security Council resolutions relating to Israel are under Chapter 6, including 242.
A resolution has to state specifically that it's according to Chapter 7 in order that it can be invoked as a mandatory resolution.
But still, it's commonly accepted.
Look, it is. And Israel's kind of accepted as, yeah.
Everything's commonly accepted. Doesn't mean that it's correct.
Yeah.
Well, you're the lawyer.
And by the way, 242 is very carefully worded, right? The British were very good at this. It's sort of creating this sort of language which keeps everybody happy, but doesn't actually say anything. The issue about the territories or not. But also it talks about there are three principles, or two main principles, that the Council recommends that the parties take into account: the principle of the non-acquisition of territory by force and Israeli withdrawal from territories, but also the right to secure boundaries.
Secure and recognize.
It's secure and recognize boundaries. It's equally important. So you can't also cherry pick in 242 and say, oh, well, Israel's required to withdraw because of 242. That's not what 242 says, even if it were binding.
There's probably one more chapter that you need in the book.
Okay.
That is, what are you going to do with a few million Palestinians? That's
Well,
really the question. What are you going to do with them?
there is already a solution, in the sense that we have, Oslo has created a degree of autonomy. Not perfect, I agree. But it's not like they don't have anything. And they're not going away, so I agree, there has to be. But on the other hand, you can say, well, they have a large degree of independence. It's not territorially contiguous, I accept that, so they don't have a contiguous homeland as they want. But they've got a pretty good deal. They have a Palestinian Authority, they have institutions, they have courts, they're getting a lot of money from the West. What more do you want to build your autonomous? So I don't believe that Israel is denying the right of the Palestinians to self-determination. On the contrary, I think Israel's gone a very long way to grant the Palestinians. They want to be separate. So do many Israelis. Okay, how do you do that? Well,
if I may just add one point here, the concept of the right of self-determination includes the right to negotiate whatever framework or structure would exist at the end of these negotiations, and therefore the Oslo Accords include an obligation by Israel and by the PLO to negotiate a final statement, a final status. So what will happen to the Arab population will be dependent on the outcome of these negotiations and the status of whatever will be agreed upon, which, as I said before, isn't determined in the Oslo Accords. It will be the outcome of whatever is agreed upon in negotiations, not the outcome of wishful thinking by European leaders or by US leaders or whatever. Yes, please.
My name's Tommy Waller. Hey,
Hello,
Andrew,
Tommy.
how you doing? I represent Hayubel. We're an organization that supports the communities that you're talking about today. I'm wondering if is there any international or is there any discussion, intellectual discussions in the legal international community about the barbaric behavior of the governments representing the Palestinians To me, it seems like that since 1967, particularly, that's what we've seen from the government. The pay to slay, it seems to be overlooked. It's not. We develop laws in the U.S. against that, but we're still doing it. We're still funding. We're still doing things like and the Hamas charter. The idea that there's no election in the Palestinian community because of these problematic government that would take over in that what we're creating is obviously a terrorist state. Is there any discussion about that? It seems to be that would be the main discussion when we're talking about a legitimacy of a Palestinian state. Why aren't we going to this discussion and saying, you've proved yourself since 1967 and before. Why are we still going down this road?
Good question. Tommy, can I answer that?
Yes,
Huh?
please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also, Tommy, for I think you guys are doing great work there in an illegal settlement. Look, there is a discussion, but it's very much on the margins, You've got to work really hard to get a resolution by the European Parliament condemning anti-Semitism in Palestinian school books. So we had one just a couple of days ago, strong resolution condemning the incitement to terror in Palestinian school. But I mean, that's hard work, even getting a resolution like that, which has very little impact anyway because it's just the Parliament. And so I think many people know there's a problem. In my view, I think the core of it is if you've put a lot of money and you've put your reputation on the line in creating this thing, you have to be very brave to acknowledge that what you've tried to create is failing. And it's a kind of a regulatory capture. Europe has invested itself, also its reputation in this Palestinian entity. So to admit that it's not what we want it to be is highly difficult. That's why they give very little transparency about where the money is going. If you go onto the website of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is putting, let's say, 30 to 40 million euros a year into the PA through different projects. What are those projects? Who's getting that money? And what are they doing with it? You can't find it on the website. They won't give it to you. And they'll say the reason we can't give it to you is because it will harm the recipients of the money. The do no harm principle. And we say, well, hang on a moment. You are giving money to an entity, probably an NGO, a Palestinian NGO, which has an anti-Israel agenda, we know. Because we kind of know who the recipients are. We know most of them are opposed to a two-state solution. But you're not willing to tell us as citizens and taxpayers in Europe where our money is going. And I think it's because they're so deeply in bed with the Palestinians that they cannot admit even to the Palestinians that something is going wrong. So it is a huge problem, and I think to get to the bottom of it, I don't know how we're going to do it. But the whole pay for slay thing. There are people going consistently to governments to talk about, and they know it's happening. Of course, every government knows what's going on. There's no secret about pay for slay policy, and that European money is being diverted for that purpose. But it's not a strong enough argument, apparently, to recognise that there's a fundamental problem here. It's not a very good answer, I'm afraid. But yeah, sorry, Alan.
Yes, yes.
With all the proposals that you have put forward, can you give us any positive examples of what you have been able to do up until now against the anything positive? Because there's so many things that need to be done.
Yeah.
What has actually been done?
Okay. So, well, first of all, this report has just been released, so we haven't had much opportunity yet. So I can't say there's a lot we have achieved, but I think there are a lot of organisations who over the last 10, 15 years have been working very hard in European capital cities to bring these issues to the attention. I think there is a growing awareness of the fundamental problems. So I think there has been, like, pay for slaves very much on the agenda now. School books is definitely on the agenda. You know, people know. I think there's a more awareness. Status of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization.
We all lobbied on those together.
Exactly. So there's a lot of very good organizations doing this work. I think it's having impact, but it's a long road. It's a long road, and there has to be good coordination, I think, which is happening. So the outlook is not entirely negative, and there are a lot of politicians in Europe who are now highly aware of the issues and lobbying within their own governments. But that's hard. I mean, I'll give you an example. In the Netherlands, a member of the coalition government is the Christian Union. It's a smaller political party, Christian political party, which has been traditionally very pro-Israel. And they have a very good pro-Israel platform within the government. But they're going through their own internal crisis, where many of the Christians making up their constituents are very pro-Palestinian. So there's a lot of work to be done at the grassroots level to be persuading them about, because they don't understand much. My own view at the end as well is there's another number of governments in Europe which are not in favour of this two-state policy. So we mentioned a few of them: Czech Republic, Hungary, others, and they will push back. They are pushing back. So to a large extent, the problem is one of rhetoric. It's money getting into the wrong hands, yes. But on the other hand, I think there is a political growing awareness about the fundamental issues.
Question at the back?
Yes. Hi, Maurice. Thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. To what extent do you believe that the problem is educational background, that the Europeans simply don't know the history of what happened here, as opposed to they just don't care? When you read some of their position papers and policy papers, it does seem to be clear that they are developing in the direction of further understanding that the aid has just failed. If you read their 2017 plan, there were non-negotiable principles of democracy and transparency. When you read their new plan, well, those non-negotiable elements have disappeared, and they've developed into identifying the positions that need to be improved in Palestinian society. I mean, they clearly do understand that their aid till now has basically failed, and therefore if they're just ignorant of the past, which I'm hesitant possibly to accept, and they realise that what they've been doing for the last 50 years has also failed. What do you think could explain their dogmatism of we just have to push on no matter what, even though we understand that everything is bad?
It's a good question, Maurice. Thank you. I think you're doing great work, by the way, at Palestinian Media Watch, so I want to acknowledge that. I wish I could answer it. The problem is the Europeans, they've dug themselves into, if you've adopted a position which you say is a legal position, a legally binding position, that the Palestinians have a right to this state within these borders, it's very hard to get out of that legally. So there's an element of, like, they've set up a kind of utopian entity, and they believe deeply that it exists because they want it to exist. And that, I think, coupled with ignorance about the past. I mean, if you look at the kind of people who are coming into policy positions, advising members of parliament in Brussels, they're working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the capital cities. What do these young people know coming out of universities? if you study Olympia, you might be an exception in Italy, but I speak to young people who study Middle Eastern affairs at universities in Europe. They learn nothing about this conflict. They don't know what happened in 1967. No idea. So we have a whole generation of people coming into positions of influence who they simply have no idea. And I'm generalizing, of course. Of course there are good ones. And I think it's that coupled with the legal position that they've created themselves that gives them very little wiggle room to maneuver. That's my take.
Well, one more question, and I'd like to summarize. Thank you.
How it's deal with the conflict? The conflict, it's all the time it's political, but it was born from the religion conflict, because we the Jew and the Christian must be the under protectoration, the Ali, the Dima. It's the nation under the protection of the Islam. So they are refuse us to be here. So I hope that Ibrahim agreement with the Emirate, it will be one step to be good, because I don't think that 1 acre less and 1 acre more, it will be solve the problem.
No. Thank you. Maybe it's a really important topic to kind of finish on. I agree with you. I think it's a religious conflict at its core. And there's no secret about that either. Even the Palestinian Charter is, it's built on Islamic principles of jihad. And so even the most moderate of parties, the PA have made clear that it will be an Islamic Palestinian state where Sharia law is implemented. It'll be a Judenrein state as well. It's a problem in the West because you're not allowed to talk about these things.
Yeah.
You really are not allowed to. It's very dangerous.
Political correctness.
It's correctness, but it's fear as well.
Yeah, sure.
The demographics are such that it's very, very hard to say anything that is in the least bit slightly critical of the Muslim world or the Islam, because you're touching on territory that is so explosive. So I agree with you. I think all of what is happening is very much a dhimmi kind of attitude. We are bowing ourselves down to this. Look at all the states. We talk about the Abraham Accords, which I think are great, but when they vote in the UN, at the end of the day, even the Abraham Accord states, they're voting against Israel. They're not, this last request for an advisory opinion, 87 states adopted it, which is less than half the UN member states. Who are they? It's the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, it's the Arab League, and these bunch of other states who are too afraid to do anything else. And often because they have large Muslim majorities or populations in their countries. So, I know, it's so difficult.
Well, thank you very much. I'd just like to say a few words, principally as an international lawyer. First of all, Professor Tucker, I think in 1 hour you've probably summarized virtually everything that we've been writing here for years and years. So
I just copied and pasted.
let me congratulate you, and it was really very important and extremely interesting. But I'd like to summarize with 2 or 3 points. First of all, as I said at the beginning, the term two-state solution or two-state vision, it's spouted out glibly as if it were some type of magic panacea for all the ills of the region. And once there'll be a two-state solution, then the Messiah will emerge. As the Professor Tucker said, it lacks understanding of the meaning of two states. It lacks understanding of the history of the region, and it's a very useful form of lingua franca that leaders, especially the EU leaders, but also in the US, they can throw it out and say, yes, well, we're in favor of the two-state solution, and we're hearing this every other day from the Jordanians, from the EU statements, from the State Department, etc. It's never been agreed in any binding document, not in the agreements between Israel and its neighbors, and not in the various Security Council resolutions, which, while not binding, they serve as a basis for the peace process, and they're specifically written in the peace treaties and various other agreements that in the preambles that they are the basis. There's the 2003 Quartet Roadmap, which is a roadmap to a permanent two-state solution, but the roadmap is a guide. It calls for negotiation. It gives a timetable for negotiation of whatever will be the outcome of the negotiation. It doesn't call for a permanent two-state solution in and of itself. That's a possibility, but it has to be the result of negotiation. And I think one of the other important points is that the EU is a signatory, as witness, to the Oslo Accords. Now, according to international custom, international practice, a state or a group of states or an organization that signs as a witness to a document like this can't afterwards undermine the whole purpose of the document. And by dwelling on this two-state solution concept, they're prejudging the outcome of permanent status negotiations that they themselves are signatory to as a witness to the Oslo Accords. And this is something that is not mentioned very much, but I think it's worth mentioning, because they're ultra vires their own policy, their own signature on the Oslo Accords. The 1993 Rabin-Arafat exchange of letters, which is another document that's rarely mentioned, it specifically says that there has to be, the two sides agree to a negotiated resolution of all outstanding issues. Arafat himself is signatory to this. Not declarations or partisan resolutions or utopian wishful thinking, but a negotiated outcome of the outstanding issues. And so the Europeans can't, in calling for this two-state solution, they're going ultra vires the basic agreements between the Palestinians and the Israelis on this, and they're prejudicing the integrity of the Oslo Accords, and they're prejudicing their own credibility as serious participants in the process. There are other legal points. The term occupied Palestinian territory, which is parroted all the time, assumes that the territories are Palestinian, despite the fact that the Palestinians themselves are committed, together with Israel, to negotiating the outcome of the permanent status negotiations. So the occupied Palestinian territories is a fiction, but it's been accepted. It's been accepted by the UN. It's been accepted by the Secretary Generals of the UN. It's been accepted by the International Criminal Court, and part of Israel's documentation that it's been sending to the International Court stresses this fact, that there's no such thing as sovereign Palestinian territory. Therefore, the International Criminal Court can't extend its jurisdiction to deal with claims of Israeli war crimes, because there's no Palestinian sovereignty over any of the territory, because it's subject to an ongoing negotiation. And then, of course, the 1967 borders, quote unquote. There's never been 1967 borders. It's a false, a fake claim. There's the 1949 armistice demarcation lines. There's never been any agreement on 1967 borders. Resolution 242 calls for, as we said, the negotiation of secure and recognized boundaries. So the assumption is that the issue of borders has to be negotiated, and this is one of the points agreed between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that the issue of borders is a final status issue, together with Jerusalem, together with settlements, together with refugees, and security and water and other things. So there are a whole number of false assumptions involved in this term two-state solution, and it's so important that this research is now available, and what needs to be done now is to bring it to the attention of anybody who's involved, whether it's international judges, whether it's parliamentarians, whether it's government leaders. And so thank you very much, Professor Tucker. It's been